This is the IBJ podcast for the week of May the 4th, 2020, brought to you by the law firm Craig DeVault. I'm Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. As I said at the top, today is May the 4th. The rent for May is due. It's past due. And given what we know now about unemployment and the home and apartment rental marketplace in Indiana, we can safely say that many tens of thousands of rental tenants in Indiana haven't paid their May rent yet and are struggling to scrape up the money. If you're really interested, I have a back of the napkin figure here of about 60,000 renters in Indiana. That's with a base number of 750,000 rental units in the state from the 2010 census, and industry estimates that 8% of renters nationwide were at least partially delinquent with their April rent. The global economic swoon caused by the coronavirus crisis isn't going to break out of its nosedive anytime soon. We know that 30 million people have filed for initial unemployment benefits in the last 6 weeks, with about 550,000 of them in Indiana. So what we have on our hands here is a rental housing crisis, on top of all the other crises that have popped up in the last 2 months. Now, tenants in Indiana have been shielded from eviction since mid-March, thanks to a moratorium issued by Governor Eric Holcomb. But advocates for both low-income residents and for landlords say more must be done to aid renters. Both sides are working their connections in Congress and in the Indiana State House to establish an emergency rental assistance program that would help tenants cover the rent and keep revenue flowing for apartment owners. But they have to contend with the sticker shock. Estimates from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition find that some 200,000 low-income Hoosier households will need short-term rental assistance totaling $1.34 billion. For this week's podcast, I've invited two people who are in the thick of the efforts to free up money for rental assistance, which probably would end up being some combination of federal, state, and third-party funds. Here's our conversation. Joining me in the IBJ podcast virtual studio is Lynn Peterson, the president of the Indiana Apartment Association. That's a trade association that represents more than 230,000 apartment units in the state. Lynn, thank you so much for making time today.
No problem. Thanks for asking.
And also with us is Andrew Bradley. He's policy director for Prosperity Indiana. That's a statewide network that supports community economic development. It stitches together a wide variety of organizations, including not-for-profits, banks, housing authorities, social service organizations, and government agencies. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mason. Good to be here.
So I just wanted to give a little bit of context on the timing of our conversation. Today is Thursday, April 30th. Yesterday, we learned that the U.S. economy shrank 4.8% on an annualized basis in the first quarter of 2020. Maybe more to the point of our discussion today, the economy is expected in the second quarter to contract by maybe as much as 40%. This is the greatest percentage, at least since the Great Depression. We know that about 550,000 Hoosiers have applied for initial unemployment benefits in the last 6 weeks. And next week, we're going to get the U.S. unemployment numbers for April. And the unemployment rate almost certainly will be in the double digits. I've seen everything from 15 to 20%. Which is to say, there are a lot of people who are out of work. There are a lot of people who will be out of work. And even under the most optimistic scenarios, it's going to take a while for them to get back on the job and work out all their financial issues. So Andrew, let me ask you first, what is it about the coronavirus crisis that in particular has been so devastating to people who rent?
I think one thing is that we just don't know all of the answers or the data yet. You referenced that over 500,000 Hoosiers have successfully filed for unemployment. But we know, at least anecdotally, and I think by the state would recognize this, that we don't know yet how many haven't been able to file for unemployment, but who have lost their jobs totally, or who have had their hours reduced, or have been furloughed for part of the time, but have been on the job for other weeks over the past month and a half since this public emergency hit. So I think that's a big challenge, is that we don't know yet the full scope of this thing. We are starting to get a few pieces about what are the types of occupations that have been hardest hit. And there's some things that you kind of know intuitively. Restaurants and bars have been closed. So those are some of the occupations that are hit. But actually the number one occupation, according to some data from IU's IBRC, the Business Research Center, just this week, is that manufacturing is the number one occupation affected during this time. So it really cuts across a lot of demographics, a lot of occupations. But we also know that at least medically, by the numbers that the state has released, that it's Hoosiers of color that have really been impacted heaviest. And based on some previous data that we have, those are the Hoosiers that are most likely to be in some of the renters that have been affected. Those who are in service industries, those who are in restaurant and bar industries.
If I miss 1 month rent, what kind of financial bind does that put me in? Is it one of the situations where my problems start to cascade?
Hoosiers who have a cash reserve, it's a low percentage. If I recall, the average Hoosier, or at least average American, has less than $400 in reserve. And so if they missed a rent payment due to income loss out of no fault of their own, there's your $400 right there.
Sure.
And I think in addition to that, we know that certain populations, including Hoosiers of color, have less accumulated wealth than others. And I think that we're going to start to see that means that they're more impacted by the ability to be able to pay rent.
Mason, we have seen some of the residents that have been hardest hit have been our workforce housing. We're trying to track our payment rates for housing type, and we're seeing them hit really hard. And the concern, as Andrew stated, is that if people get too far behind, and we found a month or two in rent, it's very, very difficult for them to make that up.
Why can't the apartment owner just waive 1 month's rent? Let's say I say, I'll cover the utilities. It should just be a wash for you. Why is that really not feasible?
Well, that's difficult because of the expenses that we have on the property. I mean, we have to pay the staff salaries. We're just like any other business that we need people to pay, or if you buy something to purchase it, it goes for other expenses. We have our property taxes. We have our mortgage payments, we have our staff salaries and all of that. And there's just, rental housing isn't a high profit industry. We have a breakdown of a chart of where every dollar of rent goes. And it doesn't leave much left over when you look at, you have to have capital expenditures, your mortgage payments, all of that. We break it down in Indiana, about 7 cents is left over out of every dollar that goes into the owner's pocket.
Now, the first indication that we had for tenants struggling to pay their rents was at the beginning of this month. And I know there's some nationwide figures that only about 69% of renters paid any of their rent between April 1st and 5th. By the end of the month, it had reached 89%, and normally it would have been about 95. At this point, do we know the percentage of renters in Indiana who are still delinquent on their April rent?
We are tracking this through our members. So this would just be based on membership, and we represent about 250,000 units across the state, multifamily properties. And we are currently seeing from the April payments about an 8 to 10% delinquency rate. And keep in mind the delinquency rate average is about 1 to 2%.
Mm-hmm. So that's way above normal.
Yes.
How many apartment units are there in Indiana?
We represent, about a third of Hoosiers rent in the state of Indiana. And so that would take into consideration, some single family rentals as well. That number has continued to increase over the years. We've seen as people decide to rent by choice.
Oh, that's fascinating. That reminds me that one of the things that came out of the recession was that maybe people who would normally kind of fall into line and buy a house instead were choosing to rent. And the people also people who of advanced age who had retired were kind of looking to downsize and also are renting. So over the last 10 years or so, it's fair to say that we have had even more renters than we would have in the previous decade.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see the census numbers come out when they do, to see the increase in rental population. I think you'll find that it has gone up even more than we anticipated. I mean, we can tell by the number of units that are being built across Indiana.
I'm sure that some renters feel embarrassed if they're struggling to pay the rent and they don't want to bring it up. But should they?
We have encouraged, we've provided a lot of information for our members to send out to their residents to encourage them to talk to them if they can't make their rent payment and to work out payment plans. Most of the rental housing people that I've talked to, our members and other people, have been very willing. Everybody understands this issue and been willing to work with renters as much as possible by waiving late fees, coming up with payment plans, even providing resources for renters to help them where to go to file unemployment, things like that. I've been really proud to see the outreach that has happened within our industry to help the residents.
Now, we know that on March 19th, Governor Holcomb banned evictions, which is prohibiting the landlords from initiating court proceedings to kick out their tenants. The moratorium is tied to the state of emergency that was declared for the state, which is set to expire May 5th, though I think it's expected to be extended. Also, the federal government issued a moratorium which prohibits evictions, I think, until July 25th for tenants living in units covered by a federally backed mortgage. So that takes us, at least federally, to July 25th. Andrew, is that kind of moratorium going to be enough time, or do we think that now needs to be extended?
Well, I think at the state level, frankly, I'd say that what we need really is a plan. And that is what will help us know if the date is right or not. And I think that the governor's been good about saying that he's making decisions based on the facts on the ground. And I think that the facts on the ground are, we don't have them all yet, as we've talked a little bit about before. And as you mentioned, the federal moratorium on properties that have a federal mortgage or federally rented is July 25th. And I think that was done to give those properties and those renters enough time to be able to plan and to be able to have a savings and to be able to put the federal unemployment insurance into place. As far as the state goes, what we don't want to see is that light flip back on May 5th and say that suddenly, all the back payment is due right up, or, folks could be out. That would be really the worst case scenario. What a group of advocates that Prosperity Indiana has been working with, called the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition, we're about to make a set of recommendations, and happy to give a little preview today. We're recommending that the state either match that federal moratorium, or it needs to have a plan in place for emergency rental assistance, so that when that moratorium is finally lifted, that there is something in place that helps Hoosiers in need kind of like transfer off so that they are not faced with a rental cliff.
Yeah, so Lynn, as soon as the moratoriums are over, will we see landlords just start trying to evict tenants?
The last thing that landlords want to do is evict a tenant, and that's why we're encouraging them to make some payment plans, because that helps keep the property going. That helps them, pay their bills. So I don't think you're going to see a huge surge if people can continue to pay their rent and work with the landlord, so we can all get through this together.
Yeah, is it one of those situations where it's almost like the same thing as trying to replace an employee, where the cost of replacing that employee is so much higher than just having kept that person in the job? Is it the same with a tenant, that the cost of turning over a unit can be, I wouldn't say prohibitive in this situation, but pretty significant?
It is. It's significant to do it. It's our last resort to file for an eviction. Because of just the nature of it, as well as because of the cost to replace a resident. And I think there will be a lot of residents that will have been impacted by COVID-19. So, our first goal is to work with our current residents.
All right, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is brought to you by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
Okay, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast. We're talking this week with Lynn Peterson, president of the Indiana Apartment Association, and Andrew Bradley, policy director for Prosperity Indiana, about the need for emergency assistance to help apartment tenants cover their rents.
So, Andrew, I think you made a reference to this. Emergency rental assistance. The housing advocates say establishing either a federal or statewide emergency rental assistance program would benefit everybody, and that they have asked Congress to include rental assistance in future federal stimulus packages. And then last week, I think a group of 17 Hoosier housing providers and housing security advocates sent a letter to U.S. Senator Todd Young asking him to urge the Senate to authorize $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and I think all of those pieces reflect that Indiana is going to need an in this together housing stability response. And it's going to take our federal policymakers, state policymakers, and our community leaders, renters, and landlords all coming together to make this solution work. And I think what we're starting to realize is it's not going to be one of those pieces carrying the rest. The federal government, Congress, in the CARES Act did include some important pieces that could help lay the foundation for an Indiana in this together housing security response. But it's not all there yet. I think some of those pieces included some resources that would help stem a tide of homelessness, that would help provide support to homelessness shelters. Some would help some local communities and municipalities shore up some of their resources. But I think that the data that we've talked about in terms of unemployment is going to tell us that it's not going to be enough by itself. And so a group of advocates has turned to Senator Young. He's been a champion before on housing security issues, and we're hoping that he will come through again and be a champion again. But we want some of the rest of our congressional delegation to also step up and get behind this ask to make sure that there are enough resources to provide an emergency short-term rental assistance fund. Mm-hmm. I think, though, that for Indiana, because Indiana's not sitting on large pots of money that it uses for rental assistance right now, they're going to need to get creative and do things kind of the Hoosier way of putting together resources. And that may include some community and third-party resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what would that look like?
I've been doing some research about what some other states have been putting into place. I've been encouraged by what I've seen by states including Texas and Arizona that have a statewide resource. They have a website where if you are a renter that needs assistance, you can go and at least apply through the state. And it's not necessarily that the state itself is providing all the money, but they are connecting you with providers in your region that may have some additional resources. And in addition, Texas has gone and asked for some waivers from HUD, the Federal Housing and Urban Development Agency, and that's allowing them some additional funds through flexibility that they're able to use for some emergency rental assistance. Mm-hmm. I think what we don't want to see is that we're basically just telling newly unemployed, newly stricken renters that you're on your own and you should be reaching out just to your churches or your local charities to ask if they happen to have pots of money. Instead, I think it's better for Indiana to set up the foundation and allow those additional resources, be they federal, state, or community, to help go to the people who are most in need.
So, Lynn, what would be helpful for the apartment owner's perspective? Does that sound good? Are there other things that they're interested in?
We've also talked with Senator Young. We had our leadership meeting with him and also stressed there needs to be some kind of rental assistance put together. I mean, we don't know what that looks like. We're kind of with Andrew on that. It's going to be, it depends on, we can't prescribe what that looks like. There's a real problem on the federal level. If you produce aid for rental assistance, how do you get it to the people? How do you get it to the landlord? What's it look like? Do you have a debit card for rent? How does that all work? We've never been in this situation before, and it's evident by that everywhere we look, there's really not much rental assistance. When you look at what the state can do, the township trustee in Indiana has been basically in charge of poor relief, and there's funds there, but that's never enough. There's, they use that for utility payments for people that may be out of work, for rental payments, some other things. But, we don't, while we don't have the answers, we're struggling and saying we need something. It's evident.
Do you think this really does need to be a federal response?
I think it needs to be both. I don't know where the state's going to end up. Before, I would say we could talk to the state and go and talk with them about some funds. But, as you see unemployment going crazy and not having money with the gas tax and all of our taxes, that'll be a struggle too. But I think I'm with Andrew. We've got to hit it on both state and federal levels to get some kind of funding.
I want to bring up a statistic that I saw. The National Low Income Housing Coalition found that some 200,000 low-income Hoosier households will need short-term rental assistance, and that would total about $1.3 billion.
I've seen that, and that comes from estimates that they put out in a policy brief where they were pegging this to if we have the same unemployment issues that we did during the Great Recession, that those are the numbers that we would need. And unfortunately, if you've looked at some of those graphs, the spike in unemployment from this coronavirus crisis dwarfs that of the Great Recession. Now, under the most optimistic projections, maybe that all goes back down and we're all back to normal. But frankly, as we've talked about a little bit before, even those who have been out of work for a few weeks or a couple of months might have some real problems getting to anything close to back to normal. So while that number, I think, could produce a little bit of sticker shock, 1.3 billion for rental assistance in Indiana, I think it's pretty realistic to what we may see, especially if Indiana's faced with anything like a resurgence of the virus in the fall or any sort of hiccups getting back to normal. What's part of that number too, that number estimates 200,000 Hoosier rental households who may need rental assistance. But a big part of that is a surge of 41,000 plus new households who never needed assistance before, but who may need that assistance now.
How long can apartment owners hold out? Let's say the 10% of their tenants can't pay their rent for several months. How long before they really do start needing to change over units and evict people?
That's going to depend on the property and some of the reserves that they may have. So it depends. One thing that we were hoping that would be helpful in the CARES Act, there was relief for forbearance so that multifamily properties, if they were getting into some problems, they could suspend their mortgage payment. But unfortunately, when we looked further into that in some of the members, they basically have to use all their operating and capital reserves. So they almost have to go into foreclosure before that can happen. And that's what we try to avoid, because when you don't do capital projects, you can't upkeep your property. You have difficulty with staffing levels. There's a lot of things there. So we're real concerned that because of the rules that were put into place, that any kind of forbearance that a property may need, they're not going to be able to get to, they almost go into foreclosure.
Yeah, and that occurred to me as well. I mean, how big a danger is lenders eventually foreclosing on apartment buildings where the owner is having trouble paying the mortgage?
Yeah, I mean, we're at a spot we've never been before. We really are in our housing industry right now. We don't know how this is going to impact all of us, or what we're going to see as we go forward. I mean, we're exploring every option available to assist residents with rent payments. But if the rent isn't paid, we don't know what we're going to see. It's going to leave us kind of with a tidal wave of unforeseen challenges, and we're not sure we have a lifeboat right now from our side of it.
Are apartment owners able to show and lease new units right now? I mean, has that process been affected? I would assume that it has been.
Actually, apartment community have been listed as essential workers. So we have been able to remain open, but things have changed drastically. We are doing, most of them are being virtually leased. So they're leasing through FaceTime, showing apartments that way. Appointments only, we're seeing that.
Both of your perspectives, what do you want to see happen next?
So I guess, jumping in immediately, we definitely do need to make sure that we have a plan in place that extends the pause on evictions until we have an emergency short-term rental assistance. It has to go in that order. We can't throw people to a place where they're subject to homelessness or lack of housing security before we have some sort of assistance. Longer term, though, we want to make sure that the policy response is something that actually builds up and supports long-term housing stability. And I think a lot of what Lynn has talked about is absolutely fair. Like, we want to make sure that housing providers who are doing the responsible thing and who are looking out for their employees and for their tenants aren't left out in the cold as part of this plan. I'm thinking about what are some possible market-based incentives for those who are, working with their tenants the way that she described and coming up with payment plans.
We need rental assistance too. That's what we're advocating for on the federal level is rental assistance. We realize that the unemployment rates are staggering and everything else. So, if people are getting help with their rent getting paid, we're able to operate our properties in the fashion that they need to be operated. At the end of the day, our industry doesn't want the black eye of, this all ended and there's evictions everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not what we're about. And if you look at it logically too, if you have to do these huge evictions, well, the property's still empty. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
The bottom line is that then the owner isn't able to pay his bills, pay his mortgage. So it's not something we want to see, or we want that, on our backs and of evicting people. So I think we're very eager to work with people, but it's been interesting. We're struggling on the federal level, and I think Andrew would agree, of trying to get some assistance for renters. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a top priority.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you make it a top priority? I mean, you've talked to your senator. Is there anything else you can do?
Oh, I mean, we're affiliated with the National Apartment Association, and we've been doing grassroots, reaching out to all of the congressional delegates across the country, just to telling, what dire shape we're in, and that we don't know how this is going to impact our business. One of our big pushes is, while you see these moratoriums, we hope that we have backing from lawmakers and from everyone to encourage people that can pay their rent to pay their rent, because that's when we start getting into some difficult situations, when people just say, there's an eviction moratorium, I'm not going to pay my rent. Mm-hmm. And that's what our industry is really concerned with, is that you start seeing these non-payment rents soar from people that really could pay their rent. What we want to do is to encourage people two things: encourage people that can pay their rent to pay their rent, so that we can keep the property going and meet our obligations as a business. And then secondly, those that have been impacted by COVID-19 to reach out to their landlord and to try to set up some type of a payment plan.
And I think I'd add to that, I think by having a plan, both by federal and state policymakers, that'll help give renters the confidence that, that yes, they can go ahead and pay as they're able. And they know that, now that we've had some uninsurance come through, now that we've had a stimulus check, there's still people who haven't received those. So they may be holding back, making sure that they're able to put food on the table night to night. But once those pieces come in, and especially once we have a plan for emergency short-term rental assistance, then I think people will be able to use what they have and continue to pay.
My thanks again to Lynn Peterson and Andrew Bradley. IBJ Sam Quinn has a story in the latest issue of IBJ about the big rent crunch if you'd like to learn more. Also, in this week's issue, Lindsay Erdoty has the latest on the deluge of candidates vying for Indiana's 5th congressional district seat. 15 of them are in the GOP, and Lindsay has profiled each one while also outlining what is so different about this year's election. The Democrats get their chance next week. And John Russell delves into the growing effort to beat back the coronavirus by tracing the personal contacts of people who have tested positive. You can read these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or, of course, online at ibj.com. Much of our coverage of the coronavirus crisis can be accessed for free on the website for all readers, and that includes our continuously updated digest of all the latest news. It's called The Latest, and you'll see it on the IBJ homepage. And remember, for unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content from today, yesterday, and the previous economic crisis, just hit the subscribe button. Thanks for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. Hang in there, everybody. I'm Mason King. We'll be back again next week.